Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. I recently did a video on George Martin and his observations on the Sgt. Pepper album. It was taken from his book with a little help from my friends. I love that we get to stand beside George Martin in the studio and be in the middle of the making of the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album. So, watching this video, you don't have to have seen my previous video, because each video works in letting us into the world of George Martin with the Beatles. So let's see what happens next. The influences of the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album. Well, the Beatles were influenced by Bob Dylan. He had released his album Subterranean Homesick Blues in April 1965. It not only influenced the Beatles, but the pop world in general. Surprisingly, the blues influenced the Beatles too. In the era of the Beatles, a lot of groups were influenced by the blues. They took the country blues sound created during the 1930s and created the urban electric blues. The Beatles liked the blues because the songs were direct and the songs were emotions. And the Beatles also liked the loudness and the rawness of the guitar work and the heavy backbeat. The Beatles' influences went in other directions as well. The blues were more important to John, George, and Ringo than it was to Paul. And Paul's dad had a local dance band, and he would play American popular music. And Paul's dad probably played dance hall standards and jazz, so Paul was listening to that and keeping it in his mind. And Paul also said his dad liked to play boogie woogie on the piano, so that helped to make Paul a great bass player. And George Harrison influenced the band with his love of Indian instruments. George started out by loving Elvis and Carl Perkins, and then branched out from there. George Martin also said that he influenced the Beatles with his formal training in classical music. And George Martin loved to experiment in the recording studio. The Beach Boys were also influencers on the Beatles. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album made the Beatles want to create great songs to equal the Beach Boys. And the Beatles got better on their harmonies thanks to the Beach Boys. And the Beatles gave that same feeling of competitiveness to the Beach Boys, making them want to produce music that would equal what the Beatles were doing. George Martin ended the chapter with a great line: "The single biggest factor in the brilliance of the Beatles' music was and always will remain their own talent." So, a day in the life. John brought this song to Paul, and they sat down in the music room in Cavendish Avenue to work on it together. John was always inspired by the things he observed and read, and John said he was writing the song with the Daily Mail propped up in front of him on the piano, and there was a paragraph about 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, being discovered, and that there was still one word missing in the verse when it came time to record. So John had the line, "Now they know how many holes it takes to," and blank the Albert Hall. He couldn't think of the verb to complete it, and his friend Terry Doran said, "Fill the Albert Hall." So Bob Dylan also influenced the song. Aunt Mimi mentioned also that one time John loved to read Henri de Balzac's short stories that were in her library, and the books dealt in realism. So John and the gang started to do a run-through of the song on January the 19th. Paul was on piano, John singing and playing acoustic guitar, Ringo on bongo drums, and George on maracas. On the first take of the tape, John began counting by saying, "Sugar Plum Fairy, Sugar Plum Fairy." It does nothing, George Martin stated, to not make you think that John was taking drugs on Sgt. Pepper. Sugar Plum Fairy was used in the drug world as the person who brings the dope. So John hated his voice. He always wanted the voice that Elvis had on Heartbreak Hotel. And to get that sound, George and the engineer put John's voice 90 milliseconds behind the actual voice, like an echo. And John loved the sound. On session 20, George Martin loved the song. John's dry, deadpan voice, Paul's bouncy middle segment. Everyone wanted a symphony orchestra, and George Martin said it would be too expensive to have 80 musicians. And George Martin wondered what they wanted to do with it. And then Paul said that he wanted to have an avant-garde sound since he had lately been listening to that kind of music. So George Martin decided to have just half an orchestra, a smaller string section, single woodwind, and brass, 41 musicians. And George Martin wrote the score out. The Beatles were excited. They asked George if he would wear evening dress and have the orchestra to do it too. And they said they would also dress up. The Beatles didn't live up to their bargain. They ended up wearing flamboyant floral costumes, not quite Sgt. Pepper costumes, but very flower power, according to George Martin. They wanted to have a party, so they invited about 40 people. That included Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, Patty Harrison, Brian Jones, Graham Nash, to name a few. So people were running around with sparklers and blowing bubbles through clay pipes. And I wonder what the orchestra people thought of all that. And then when it came time to record, George Martin asked them to sit around the walls and behave themselves, and they did. George Martin thought A Day in the Life was a special song, even before the orchestra got in on it. George was captivated by John's voice, and he felt that on this track, John's voice was at its best. George said that John was in awe for technical matters outside of his experience. He was always annoyed that they only had a limited number of recording tracks. George Martin felt the same way, but he said that the EMI in Abbey Road's manifestation was not unlike Rolls-Royce at that time, a little conservative, but still staffed by cracking engineers. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This song led to the concept album. It seems Elvis Presley may have inspired the album. He once set his Cadillac on tour without accompanying it. The idea grew in their minds, and they said, why don't we make an album that is a show and send that on tour instead of ourselves? And that time, it was a radical idea. So Paul came up with the idea when he was on a plane. The song was about a fictitious band, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it gradually grew to the Beatles being that band. The Beatles felt the studio was a playground, and George Martin said they worked very long hours there. They would be there early in the morning, and George said in 1966 they would become more demanding, and they would call up and say they wanted everyone in at 8 p.m., and everybody had to be there. So good morning, good morning. This was John's song inspired by a TV commercial for Kellogg's cornflakes, and that's why they had a cock crow at the end of the song. It was a nod to the Kellogg's trademark. And cornflakes were also one of John's favorite foods. So John would be at his piano in his home with the TV playing softly in the background, and he would pay more attention to the TV when the song wasn't going well. And when the cornflake commercial came on, he found a song. And sometimes John felt that living in the suburbs of Weybridge wasn't inspiring him to write songs, and he would drive up sometimes and spend the night at Paul's place in central London, not far from Abbey Road. So John was kind of jealous of Paul, who was a bachelor at that time, and going around London town. John felt like he was a middle-aged man. He would get bored easily, and Weybridge was the place to go, like Beverly Hills is to Hollywood. John appeared happy there, but he wanted something more exciting. And Yoko held the key to the suburban mentality he was in. According to Paul, she gave him the freedom to do all that stuff he really wanted to do. He couldn't really do it from the golf club. Fixing a Hole. This song only took 2 days to record because Paul knew exactly what he wanted. The song was built around a harpsichord and a bass guitar. Paul liked playing his own keyboards, but in this song he needed to play the bass because, according to George Martin, no one could play the instrument like him. And George Martin provided the keyboards on this song. And when the Beatles began, Paul didn't want to play the bass. Stu Sutcliffe, the bass player at the time, was really an artist, and he really didn't have a knack for the bass, and when he left and later died, Paul took over. George Martin said that Paul was the most talented musician. When George first met him, Paul couldn't play the piano at all. Paul could play the drums technically better than any of the others, including Ringo, but Paul could never get anything like the distinctive sound that Ringo got from the kit. And George said something very interesting. He said Fixing a Hole was the first time they went outside Abbey Road studio to record during Sgt. Pepper. He said Paul would have a song come to him instantly, and he had to crystallize it. He didn't know how to write music. He would scribble out lyrics, so he had no other way to grab a song out of his head but to record it. George said a Walkman would have come in useful. So I know at that time, during those years, my dad had like a small white tape recorder on reels with a microphone. So Paul could have used something like that, I was thinking. So then they find a studio for Paul, and they couldn't find one that was available, so they went to a demonstration studio, and they made tracks there, and Paul took home a rough mix to think about it overnight. And then they went back to Abbey Road on February 21st, and they got a master of it after 2 sessions. George said that John would have a pretty good idea of where he wanted to go in a song, too. He would have an image in his mind, but he didn't have a good idea of how to get there. So I'm going to stop at this point. The next video will wrap up George's thoughts and memories of the Sgt. Pepper album. I bought the book a few years ago and had forgotten all the wonderful stories George told about his days in the studio with the Beatles making it. So it's wonderful to find out just how a song came to be and what inspired it. The Beatles and George Martin made quite a team, and they helped to create a very magical album. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I can't wait to find out more about how the album came to be, and I hope you want to find out more too. And I also hope that everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.